It's strange how a single sentence can carve itself into your soul, how a handful of careless words can echo louder than anything else you've ever heard. I had always believed that home was where you were safest, where love was unconditional and support never wavered. But that illusion shattered the night I overheard my father speaking to my brother. I hadn't meant to listen in. I was just passing by the living room when I heard my name and paused. What I heard next felt like a slap I wasn't prepared for. Your sister, she isn't worth a penny. She's done. At first, I thought I'd misheard. My heart raced and my breath caught in my throat. Done? Worthless? Was he really talking about me? I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear more, hoping for some clarification that would soften the blow. But there was none. My father went on, speaking of me as though I were a lost cause, a burden too heavy to carry, someone who had failed so completely that there was no reason to expect anything from me anymore. My brother said nothing in response, and that silence felt like another betrayal. In that moment, everything I had believed about myself began to crumble. It wasn't just disappointment I felt, it was erasure. As if my entire existence, my struggles, my efforts, my dreams, had been dismissed with a single cruel sentence. I replayed those words over and over in my head, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. Not worth a penny. She's done. They weren't just insults, they were verdicts, judgments passed down by someone whose approval I had spent my life seeking. It hurt more than I could ever describe because this wasn't coming from a stranger or a critic, it was coming from my father, the man whose hand I had held as a child when I was scared, the man I used to run to when I needed reassurance. Now he was the source of my deepest wound. And as much as I wanted to brush it off, I couldn't. Those words planted themselves in my chest, heavy and cold, and no matter how hard I tried to breathe, they wouldn't budge. In the days that followed, I withdrew. I spoke less. I avoided eye contact. I questioned everything, every choice I had made, every dream I still held onto. I wondered if maybe he was right, if maybe I was done, if maybe all the effort I had put into proving myself had amounted to nothing. It's terrifying how quickly self-doubt grows when someone you love waters it with cruelty. It doesn't just grow, it spreads, infecting every part of your mind until you start believing the lies spoken about you. But beneath the sadness, beneath the humiliation, something else started to stir, something darker, something hotter. It wasn't hatred, not exactly. It was a stubborn, burning defiance. If I was truly worthless, then why did those words hurt so much? If I was truly done, then why was there a part of me screaming that I wasn't? I realized then that the pain I felt was proof that I still cared about myself, about my future, about proving that my story wasn't over. And if my father couldn't see my worth, then maybe it was up to me to show him, not with words, but with actions. Still, the betrayal lingered. It changed the way I looked at my family. Every dinner felt colder, every conversation sharper. I noticed things I hadn't before, the subtle favoritism, the small dismissals, the unspoken expectations. It was as though my father had decided my role in the family and locked me into it without ever giving me a chance to rewrite it. My brother was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, while I had been quietly labeled as the disappointment. And now that label had been spoken aloud. But labels are only as permanent as we allow them to be. I didn't know it then, but that night would become a turning point. It was the moment I stopped waiting for validation from the people who refused to see me and started looking inward for strength. Of course, I didn't suddenly become fearless or unstoppable, far from it. I still cried when no one was watching. I still felt the sting of those words every time I stumbled. But slowly, I began to channel that hurt into something productive. If they thought I was done, then I would rise from that verdict in a way they never expected. That initial betrayal shaped the foundation of what would come next. It taught me what it felt like to be underestimated by the people closest to you, to be seen as nothing more than a failure. It taught me the raw, bitter taste of rejection from within your own home. And as painful as it was, it also lit a fire in me, a desire not just to prove them wrong, but to prove myself right. Because somewhere beneath all that pain, I knew I wasn't worthless. I knew I wasn't done. And one day, they would know it too. The memory of that night never really faded. Even now, I can still hear his voice, cold, final, dismissive. But instead of letting it haunt me, I began to use it as fuel. Every doubt, every insult, every time someone underestimated me became another spark added to the fire. It was no longer about seeking his approval. It was about reclaiming the narrative of my own life. And it all began with those 6 words, words meant to break me, but which instead began to build me into something stronger. Pain changes people. It reshapes them in ways they never expect, forcing them to look at themselves differently and question everything they once believed. After hearing those words from my father, that I wasn't worth a penny, that I was done, something inside me shifted. At first, the pain was paralyzing. It wrapped itself around me like heavy chains, dragging me deeper into self-doubt with every passing day. I started to question not just my worth, but my entire identity. If the man who raised me believed I was worthless, maybe he was right. Maybe I was chasing dreams I would never reach. Maybe I was a failure who had disappointed everyone, including myself. But there's something strange about pain. Once it breaks you, it also offers you a choice. You can either stay shattered, living beneath the weight of what was said and done, or you can gather the pieces and rebuild yourself stronger than before. That choice doesn't appear all at once. It creeps up slowly, in moments when you're too tired to cry anymore, in moments when you're sick of feeling small. That's how it happened for me. One day, I just got tired of hating myself. I got tired of shrinking to fit into the version of me that my father's words had created. That exhaustion became the first spark of something new, purpose. I realized that pain could either bury me or become the foundation I stood on. It was still there, raw, heavy, unrelenting, but instead of letting it control me, I decided to use it. I stopped asking myself why my father said those words and started asking myself what I could do with them. If I was worthless in his eyes, then I would build worth so undeniable that even he couldn't ignore it. If I was done, then I would begin again, but this time on my own terms. That shift in mindset didn't erase the hurt, but it transformed it. It turned my pain into purpose. Purpose became my quiet rebellion. It didn't roar or demand attention. It whispered to me in the early hours of the morning, telling me to keep going. It urged me to learn, to grow, to improve. I started setting goals, even small ones, and each time I achieved one, it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I focused on the things I could control, my effort, my discipline, my determination. I poured myself into my studies, into skills I wanted to master, into passions I had neglected because I thought they weren't good enough. And with each step forward, I felt the grip of those painful words loosen just a little. The process wasn't easy. There were days when the old doubts resurfaced, whispering that I would never be enough. There were nights when the memory of my father's voice kept me awake, replaying those words until they echoed in my chest. But each time I stumbled, I reminded myself why I had started. I wasn't doing this to prove him wrong anymore. I was doing it to prove myself right. My purpose wasn't revenge. It was redemption. It was about reclaiming my narrative from the hands of those who had tried to define it for me. Turning pain into purpose also changed the way I saw myself. Before, I had measured my worth by other people's opinions, especially my family's. I had believed that their approval was the ultimate sign that I was enough. But once I decided to transform my pain, I began to see that worth wasn't something others could give or take away. It was something I had to build for myself. And the act of building it, piece by piece, was empowering. It made me realize that I was far stronger than I had ever known. I also started noticing something else. That pain had sharpened my empathy. It had taught me how deeply words could cut, how lasting their wounds could be. And because of that, I became more careful with how I spoke to others, more understanding of their struggles. I knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be underestimated, and I never wanted to be the person who made someone else feel that way. My purpose grew beyond just proving myself. It became about lifting others, about showing that no one's story ends just because someone else says it does. There was a quiet power in that transformation. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't happen overnight. But every time I chose to rise instead of break, every time I used the pain as fuel instead of letting it consume me, I grew stronger. And with that strength came clarity. I started to understand that my father's words said more about him than they did about me. Maybe he was projecting his own disappointments. Maybe he was trying, in his own flawed way, to push me to be better. Or maybe he simply couldn't see who I was becoming. Whatever the reason, I realized it didn't matter. His opinion no longer defined my reality. That realization was liberating. It gave me permission to chase my purpose without seeking validation. It allowed me to dream bigger than I ever had before. It made me hungry for growth, not because I wanted to silence anyone, but because I wanted to become the best version of myself. And in that pursuit, I found something far more valuable than approval. I found self-respect. I learned to look in the mirror and see someone who had survived being broken and turned that pain into power. Pain had started as my enemy. It had tried to convince me that I was nothing, that I would never rise above the words that had been spoken over me. But by choosing to transform it, I turned it into my greatest ally. It became the driving force behind every late night, every small victory, every step toward a future that was mine to shape. And as I continued to build that future, one thing became clearer with each passing day. The pain that once tried to define me was now the reason I was defining myself. Change does not always happen in the spotlight. Sometimes, the most powerful transformations happen quietly, away from the eyes of those who doubted you. After the sting of my father's words settled deep inside me and the initial fire of defiance began to burn, I knew that proving him wrong wouldn't happen overnight. It wouldn't happen with one big, dramatic gesture. It would happen slowly, deliberately, in the silence of my own efforts. I didn't need to announce what I was doing or seek validation at every step. I needed to build myself in the shadows, where no one was watching, so that when I finally stepped into the light, I would be unrecognizable from the person they once dismissed. At first, working in silence was hard. I had spent so much of my life craving acknowledgement that the idea of improving without praise felt foreign. But there was something freeing about it too. In the quiet, there was no judgment, no comparison, no pressure to meet anyone else's timeline. It was just me and the work. And so I began, taking small steps every day. I focused on what I could change about myself, my habits, my mindset, my knowledge. I started waking up earlier, creating routines, setting goals that scared me. I immersed myself in books, courses, and skills that would bring me closer to the person I wanted to become. No one noticed at first. To my family, I was still the same person, the one they had written off, the one they believed was done. They went about their days as if nothing had changed, as if my life had already been decided. But that invisibility became my advantage. Because while they weren't looking, I was building. While they still saw failure, I was quietly laying the foundation for success. And in that quiet space, something incredible happened. I stopped seeking their approval. The work I was doing was no longer about proving them wrong. It became about proving myself right, about creating a version of me that I could be proud of. There's a certain strength that comes from building in silence. It teaches you patience, discipline, and resilience. It teaches you that progress isn't always visible right away, that growth often looks like repetition, like doing the same small things every day even when it feels like nothing is changing. There were days when it felt pointless, when I wondered if all my effort was leading anywhere. But each time doubt crept in, I reminded myself why I started. I wasn't chasing quick validation anymore. I was chasing lasting transformation. Working in the shadows also gave me space to make mistakes without fear of judgment. I failed a lot. I stumbled over new challenges, faced setbacks, and had moments when I questioned everything. But because no one was watching, I didn't have to hide those failures or feel ashamed of them. Instead, I learned from them. Each failure taught me something new, strengthened my resolve, and sharpened my skills. Slowly, those small lessons built into something bigger, something stronger. I also learned to listen to myself during this time. In the noise of other people's opinions, it's easy to lose your own voice. But in the silence, I started hearing mine more clearly. I discovered passions I had ignored, strengths I hadn't realized I possessed, and dreams I had once dismissed as impossible. I began to understand who I truly was, not who others said I was. And that understanding became the compass that guided my every move. As the months passed, the transformation deepened. My mindset shifted from one of scarcity to one of possibility. I stopped seeing myself as someone who had failed and started seeing myself as someone who was learning. I stopped focusing on what I lacked and started focusing on what I could create. That shift in perspective changed everything. It made me bolder, more willing to take risks, more determined to push past my comfort zone. And with every step I took, the gap between who I had been and who I was becoming grew wider. Still, I kept it all hidden. I didn't announce my progress. I didn't brag about my small wins. I let the silence do its work, knowing that when the time was right, the results would speak louder than any words ever could. It wasn't about seeking revenge in the traditional sense. It was about letting my growth become the answer to the doubt that had once defined me. And deep down, I knew that when the moment came, the people who had underestimated me wouldn't know what hit them. The beauty of silent transformation is that it builds a strength no one sees coming. People tend to believe that what they see is all there is, and because they couldn't see my progress, they assumed I hadn't made any. They still whispered about my failures, still dismissed my dreams, still treated me like I was done. But what they didn't know was that beneath the surface, I was evolving. Like roots spreading beneath the ground before a tree breaks through the soil, I was preparing for something far greater than they could imagine. Every hour spent learning, every small goal achieved, every quiet victory was a brick in the foundation of the future I was creating. And with each brick, my confidence grew. Not the shallow kind of confidence that crumbles when challenged, but the deep, unshakable kind that comes from knowing you've earned every step forward. That confidence became my armor, shielding me from the doubts and judgments that had once crushed me. In those silent months, I learned that transformation doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need applause or validation. It only needs consistency, patience, and belief. I realized that the most powerful changes are often the ones no one sees until they're too big to ignore. And that became my goal, to build something so undeniable that the same people who once called me worthless would have no choice but to see my worth. The silence became my greatest ally. It gave me the space to grow without pressure, to fail without ridicule, to rebuild myself without interference. It turned me into someone stronger, smarter, and more resilient than I had ever been before. And though no one else could see it yet, I knew that the person I was becoming was far from done. I was just getting started, and the world had no idea what was coming. There comes a point in every journey where the quiet preparation must give way to bold action, where the work done in the shadows begins to shape something visible and undeniable. After months of building myself piece by piece in silence, I reached that point. I was no longer content with small, hidden victories. I wanted to test the strength I had built, to step into the world and see if I could stand tall against the expectations that once crushed me. This was the stage where I had to defy every assumption, every limitation, every cruel word that had been spoken about me. It was time to prove that I was far more than what they had decided I was. Defying expectations wasn't just about success, it was about rewriting the story that others had written for me. For so long, I had been seen as the one who would never amount to anything, the one who had already reached their limit. My father's words, "She isn't worth a penny, she's done," had painted a picture of finality, as if my story had already ended. But I was determined to show that it hadn't even truly begun. I wanted to build a life that was so far beyond the narrow vision others had for me that their words would lose all meaning. The first step was stepping out of my comfort zone. Growth can only go so far in the safety of solitude. Eventually, it has to be tested against the real world. I started putting myself in places where I could fail publicly, where the stakes were higher, where the possibility of falling short was real. It was terrifying at first. The fear of proving my father right lingered at the back of my mind like a shadow, whispering that I was still the person he believed me to be. But I pushed through it, reminding myself that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to move forward despite it. Opportunities that once intimidated me became challenges I was eager to face. I began applying for programs and projects I once believed were beyond my reach. I presented ideas in rooms where I had once stayed silent. I sought mentorship, feedback, and criticism, even when it stung. Each new experience stretched me further, forced me to grow faster, and revealed strengths I didn't know I had. And with each small victory, my confidence grew. The limits they had placed on me began to feel smaller, weaker, easier to shatter. The transformation wasn't just external, it was deeply internal too. Defying expectations meant dismantling the beliefs I had unknowingly accepted about myself. I had to unlearn the idea that I was too broken to succeed, too flawed to matter, too far gone to change. I had to replace those lies with truths I was proving through action, that I was capable, resilient, intelligent, and worthy. Every time I succeeded at something I once thought impossible, I wasn't just proving them wrong, I was proving myself right. It was around this time that people started to notice. At first, it was small, a surprised comment here, a raised eyebrow there. The same people who had written me off began asking questions, paying attention. My father, who once spoke about me as if I were finished, seemed unsure of what to make of the person I was becoming. I didn't confront him or seek his approval. I didn't need to. My actions were beginning to speak louder than his words ever had. Still, defying expectations was not a straight path. It was filled with setbacks, rejections, and moments of crushing doubt. There were times I failed despite my best efforts, times I questioned whether I was truly capable of changing the narrative. But those setbacks no longer defined me the way they once did. Instead of seeing them as proof of my worthlessness, I began to see them as steps forward, painful, necessary steps that were teaching me resilience. Each time I fell, I rose with more determination. Each time I stumbled, I learned how to walk stronger. One of the most powerful shifts happened when I stopped measuring myself against others and started measuring myself against who I had been. I wasn't trying to be better than anyone else. I was trying to be better than the version of me who believed she was worthless. And as I looked back, I saw how far I had come. The timid, broken person who once shrank under the weight of cruel words was gone. In her place stood someone who had built herself from the ground up, who had faced her pain and turned it into strength. Defying expectations also changed how I approached challenges. Instead of fearing them, I began to welcome them. Each new obstacle was an opportunity to prove that I was no longer bound by the limitations others had set for me. Each doubt cast my way was fuel for my fire. The very words that were meant to destroy me became the reason I kept pushing forward. They reminded me of why I started and how far I had come. They reminded me that I wasn't done. I was just beginning to show what I was truly capable of. And as my confidence grew, so did my ambitions. I stopped aiming for small wins and started chasing big goals, the kind that once felt unreachable. I began to see myself not just as someone trying to prove her worth, but as someone capable of shaping her own destiny. The story that others had written for me no longer mattered because I was writing my own. And in that story, I wasn't worthless. I wasn't done. I was powerful, determined, and unstoppable. Every expectation I shattered was a quiet victory, a reminder that no one else has the right to define my worth. Every time I exceeded what they thought I could do, I reclaimed another piece of myself that had been taken by their doubt. And with each step forward, I could feel the gap growing wider between who I had been and who I was becoming. The girl they had dismissed was gone, replaced by someone who refused to accept anyone else's version of her story. There is a moment in every journey when the work you've done in silence collides with the world that once doubted you, a moment when everything you've built within yourself demands to be seen. For me, that moment arrived slowly, like a sunrise creeping over the horizon. It wasn't dramatic at first, but I could feel it coming. All the hours I had spent working in the shadows, all the nights I had spent doubting myself and pushing forward anyway, all the small victories I had celebrated quietly, they were about to converge into something undeniable. It was time for the moment of reckoning, the point where the version of me they had dismissed would meet the version I had become. I remember the first time I felt it, that shift in the way people looked at me. It wasn't immediate, but it was there, subtle and unspoken. The same faces that had once looked at me with pity or disappointment now carried something different in their eyes. Curiosity. Surprise. Maybe even respect. It was as if they were seeing me for the first time, not as the person they had decided I was, but as the person I had worked so hard to become. That recognition wasn't handed to me easily. It was earned through resilience, through determination, through an unyielding refusal to stay broken. The opportunities that began to open up to me were ones I had once believed were out of reach. I was invited to projects I had been overlooked for before. People sought my input and trusted my judgment. My work, which had once gone unnoticed, started to speak for itself. It was strange at first, almost surreal, to realize that I was no longer invisible. The same people who had doubted me were now turning to me for advice, seeking my help, relying on my strength. It was a validation that ran deeper than any praise could, not because I needed their approval, but because it proved that I had become too strong to be ignored. And then came the moment I had been both dreading and anticipating, the moment my father had to see who I had become. I didn't plan a dramatic confrontation. I didn't sit him down and list all the ways he had been wrong. Instead, I simply lived my truth. I showed up as the person I had built, confident, capable, and unapologetically myself. There was no need for grand speeches or accusations. My actions did the talking for me. My success, my growth, my transformation, they all spoke louder than any words I could have said. I will never forget the look on his face the first time he saw what I had achieved. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't fall to his knees and apologize. But there was a pause, a long, heavy pause, when he realized that the daughter he had called worthless had built something far greater than he had ever imagined. He didn't have to say anything. That silence was enough. It was the silence of someone who had underestimated me and now had to confront the weight of their mistake. It was the silence of someone who had spoken a final verdict over me, only to see me rise far beyond it. But this reckoning wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about proving him wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was never defined by his words in the first place. The real victory wasn't in changing his opinion, it was in changing the way I saw myself. Standing in that moment, I realized that I was no longer the person who had been crushed by those 6 words. I was stronger, wiser, and more resilient. I had built a life that I was proud of, not because I had something to prove, but because I had chosen to believe in myself when no one else did. It was in those moments, presenting my work to an audience that once dismissed me, hearing people speak my name with respect, seeing my father struggle to reconcile his old image of me with the reality in front of him, that I understood what true triumph feels like. It's not loud or vengeful. It doesn't need to shout, "I told you so." True triumph is quiet and powerful. It's the strength that comes from knowing you've rebuilt yourself from the ashes of someone else's doubt. It's the peace that comes from no longer needing validation because you've already given it to yourself. There were still challenges, of course. Success didn't erase all the pain or heal all the wounds. There were still scars, reminders of the nights I cried myself to sleep, the days I doubted I would ever rise. But those scars became part of my strength. They were proof of everything I had endured and overcome. They reminded me that my journey wasn't defined by a single moment of betrayal, but by the countless moments of resilience that followed. The most surprising part of this reckoning was how it changed my relationship with my pain. What had once felt like a wound I couldn't escape became a source of power I could draw from. The memory of those hurtful words no longer made me feel small. Instead, it reminded me of how far I had come. It reminded me that even in my lowest moments, I had chosen to rise. It reminded me that strength isn't born in comfort, it's forged in adversity. As the recognition grew and the respect deepened, I realized that the moment of reckoning wasn't a single event. It was an ongoing process, a series of moments where the new me stepped into spaces the old me never could have. It was every time I spoke up when I would have stayed silent. Every time I succeeded in places where I was expected to fail. Every time I chose to believe in myself over the voices that had once told me I couldn't. This was the part of the journey where everything I had endured began to make sense. The pain, the silence, the struggle, it had all led here. Without it, I wouldn't have built the strength I now carried. Without it, I wouldn't have discovered the depth of my resilience. Without it, I wouldn't have learned that the most powerful form of revenge isn't anger or hatred, it's success. And not just any success, but the kind that is born from unwavering self-belief and relentless determination. Standing in that moment, I understood something profound. The people who doubt you can only define you if you let them. Their words only have power if you choose to carry them. I had carried my father's words for too long, letting them shape how I saw myself. But now, they no longer held me. They were just echoes from a past I had outgrown, reminders of a chapter one had rewritten with my own hands. And as I looked at the life I had built, I knew that I had not only survived those words, I had turned them into the fuel that propelled me forward. Revenge is often pictured as something loud and fiery, a dramatic moment of payback, a grand gesture meant to hurt the ones who hurt you. But as I walked through my journey, I came to understand that real revenge doesn't look like that at all. Real revenge isn't about anger or destruction. It isn't about proving someone else wrong just so you can watch them squirm. Real revenge is quiet. It's patient. It's powerful. It's about rising so far above the limitations they placed on you that their words lose all meaning. It's about becoming everything they said you couldn't be and doing it not for them, but for yourself. When my father said I wasn't worth a penny, that I was done, those words were meant to define me. They were meant to place me inside a box I would never escape from. And for a while, I believed they had. But as I rebuilt myself, step by step, I began to see that I had a choice. I could spend my life trying to throw those words back at him, trying to make him regret ever saying them, or I could rise so high that his opinion would no longer matter. That was the moment revenge began to change its meaning for me. It stopped being about him. It stopped being about proving anything to anyone else. It became about reclaiming my story and redefining my worth on my own terms. This shift was liberating. I stopped carrying the bitterness that had once weighed me down. I stopped replaying his words in my head, not because I had forgotten them, but because they no longer had the power to hurt me. I started focusing on building a life that felt meaningful to me, on creating success that aligned with who I truly was. Every goal I achieved, every challenge I overcame, was no longer a weapon aimed at him, it was a celebration of me. And that was the sweetest revenge of all. There is a quiet strength in rising above hatred. It's a strength that doesn't seek to destroy but to transform. It's the strength of refusing to be defined by someone else's limitations. It's the strength of building something beautiful from the very pain that was meant to break you. I learned that revenge doesn't have to be cruel. It can be graceful. It can be dignified. It can be the act of living so fully, so authentically, that those who try to diminish you are forced to confront the depth of their own mistakes. As my life began to change, I noticed a shift in how people treated me. The same individuals who once doubted me began to approach me differently. Some offered praise, others offered apologies wrapped in awkward conversations. But by then, I didn't need either. My worth was no longer tied to their recognition. Their opinions, whether positive or negative, no longer defined me. That detachment was the ultimate revenge, not indifference born of anger, but peace born of growth. Even my relationship with my father began to change. I didn't confront him about his words. I didn't demand an apology. I didn't need to. My success was visible enough to speak for itself. The daughter he had called worthless was now capable, confident, and strong. I could see the realization in his eyes, even if he never said it aloud. And that was enough. It wasn't about humiliating him or making him regret what he'd said. It was about knowing that I had built myself without his approval, that I had created value in a life he once dismissed as worthless. That was my victory. Revenge, I learned, is not about winning someone else's game. It's about creating a new one where their rules no longer apply. For so long, I had been playing by the expectations of others, measuring myself against their standards. But when I let go of that need, I found a freedom I had never known. I realized that I didn't have to chase their validation. I didn't have to make them eat their words. I just had to build a life that made me proud, and in doing so, their words became irrelevant. This kind of revenge is powerful because it's lasting. Anger fades. Bitterness consumes you more than it hurts anyone else. But growth endures. Success endures. Peace endures. And when you rise above the need to hurt those who hurt you, you take back the power they once held over you. That power becomes yours again, and with it, you can shape your life however you choose. I began to see that my story wasn't just about me. It was about anyone who had ever been called worthless, anyone who had ever been told they were done before they even had a chance to begin. My journey wasn't just proof of my strength, it was proof that no one has the authority to define your future but you. And in sharing that message, I found another layer of revenge, turning my pain into a purpose that could help others rise too. The transformation was deeper than I had expected. I wasn't just succeeding in ways my father never thought I could, I was becoming someone I genuinely admired. I was building a life I had once believed was impossible. And every step of that journey was fueled not by hatred, but by determination, resilience, and self-belief. That was the true power of revenge, not to destroy what hurt you, but to create something far greater than it. In the end, I realized that revenge isn't about them seeing your worth. It's about you knowing your worth, even if they never do. It's about standing tall in your own truth and refusing to shrink just because someone else couldn't see your potential. It's about building a future that reflects your strength, not their doubts. And when you reach that place, when you look around and see a life that once felt out of reach, you understand that the greatest revenge is not about proving them wrong. It's about proving yourself right. What once began as a desire to make someone regret their words had transformed into something far more meaningful. The girl who had been dismissed as worthless was now living a life full of purpose and strength. The pain that once felt unbearable had become the foundation of everything she had built. And in that transformation, I discovered that revenge was never about looking back at the people who hurt me. It was about moving so far forward that their opinions were left behind.